Well, welcome. Today we are having an interview with Dr. Wayne Cascio, and this is all part of my Leadership Legacy Summit, which will be rolling out here soon in June. And I've interviewed more than 20 people as part of this summit. And we'll be sending out information on LinkedIn and Facebook on how you can register for that. So today, Dr. Wayne Cascio is a distinguished university professor at the University of Colorado, and he holds the Robert H. Reynolds Chair in Global Leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver. He's a former president of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. He served as a member of the Academy of Management's Board of Governors. Professor Cascio is an active researcher, writer, and speaker. He's published more than 200 articles, book chapters, 33 books. I know Dr. Cascio best from his research on downsizing in 2008, and then now I reach out and contact him to learn more from his research about what leaders should be doing compared to what they are doing. And we're going to talk about that today. So welcome. Can I call you Wayne?
Sure, absolutely, Jen.
Okay, Wayne, thank you very much for helping me with my summit. And I do think of you as the downsizing guru. Definitely at least one of them, because in fact, the latest edition of Harvard Business Review on how to lead in times of crisis cites your work and studies.
Wow, that's impressive. Yeah.
Yes. So, and I know you just completed a 3-year research project about the long-term effects of restructuring. So start by telling us about this work.
Well, I actually wanted to do this work. I had the idea back in 2012, and I just needed people who had the ability to work with very large data sets. They call it panel data, where you have repeated measures like companies' stock returns year after year after year, or their financial results year after year after year. And you get into some very big sample sizes pretty quickly once you start doing that kind of work. So I finally located in 2016 a finance professor, actually 2 finance professors who had this kind of expertise, and I had the ideas, but they had never really done anything in this area. So it took us a while. Interdisciplinary research is hard, Jan.
Sure.
It's really hard. You use different vocabulary, you just different procedures and all of this. But long story short, what we did was we captured financial data from every company publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange from 1980 to 2016, so over a 37-year period.
Wow.
So there were recessions, there were ups, downs, all kinds of things, and we could really take a very in-depth and longitudinal view of how companies did, what they were doing, and how those strategies panned out. And we looked at companies that were downsizing employees, also downsizing assets or downsizing both, and also companies that were upsizing, adding employees, adding assets, like buying another company, or adding both. And so we were looking at restructuring broadly to include 2 types, upsizing and downsizing, and then two forms, which is employees, assets, or both.
Wow. And, so that longitudinal study takes into consideration, the whole evolution of technology and Silicon Valley. And
exactly.
And then you've got your old standard Fortune 500 that, we used to think of Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola. And
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And these, you need people with real econometric expertise, because you mentioned something just now that is so important, the effects of technology over time. Lots of firms have downsized because they have automated lots of jobs that people used to do. For example, in the finance function, expense reporting and accounts payable, accounts receivable, all of these things are now largely automated. So some of the biggest downsizers have been the corporate finance departments in major companies.
Wow. Well, I know that you mentioned to me earlier that this research is in, stages of publication. But so
Mhm.
tell us, can we get an inside peek here in terms of, did upsizing and downsizing, did they have anything in common, or what were your major ahas from all of this?
Yeah, yeah, I'm good. Thank you for asking. The paper is currently in press at the Academy of Management Journal. It has been published online, and I've gotten permission from the Academy to talk about this before
Oh,
it's
great.
actually officially published. So I'm happy to do that. And one of the things, the title of it is Antecedents and Consequences. So what leads up to it, and what results as a result of doing downsizing or upsizing. And so in terms of antecedents, what predicts whether a company is going to downsize or upsize? What we found, amazingly, Jan, is that the same set of predictors forecast upsizing and downsizing. And the most important of all of those is how a company is doing, how it's doing financially. Okay. The second best predictor is what we call managerial foresight. What managers think about the future prospects for the company. So we looked at whether they were increasing dividends, for example, which would suggest that they think the company's got a bright future. And we went back 2 years before the event, and we looked at 2 years after. So you look 2 years before, the year of the event, downsizing or upsizing, and 2 years after to see what happened. And I'll first talk about the antecedents, what leads up to it, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the consequences. So it turns out that company performance is the best predictor. And when we say company performance, we're looking at things like net operating income, and also stock returns, stock prices up to 2 years earlier and 2 years later. But company performance is the best predictor. The second is managerial foresight. Mm-hmm. And then from there, it goes to what's happening in the economy. What's happening in the economy? When the economy is it's improving, that discourages downsizing. When the economy is going down, that encourages downsizing.
Yes.
Okay. So you look at what's going on in the economy, and then a fourth predictor, which is nobody's ever looked at before, but I bet a lot of people are going to start looking at it now, is something called political uncertainty. Political uncertaity.
You think we're in that time?
Yeah.
Yeah. You think that's relevant?
But we got an index from the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia. They actually track this political uncertainty. They actually analyze published newspaper reports and things like that, and they come up with an index each month and each year. And it turns out the political uncertainty index is a very good predictor of whether companies are going to upsize or downsize, because you don't want to make a big move if it's highly uncertain. You're in an uncertain environment. So those were the four most important predictors of all. Also, the industry that a company is in makes a big difference. And lastly, the effects of technology matter. We've seen that, and it shows up over time. For example, we started in 1980. I mean, the IBM PC wasn't introduced till 1981.
Right.
So we have data going back to the very early days of personal computers and looking at how that has affected company actions in upsizing and downsizing all the way through to 2016.
Boy, I think you probably have research that you can mine for decades here.
Oh, yeah.
Really rich. Yeah. So,
but the takeaway is that the same set of factors predict upsizing and downsizing, which is absolutely fascinating.
Right. That is fascinating.
And then if we talk about consequences,
yes,
what we find is that if you look at employee downsizers, they typically do it when the company is not doing badly. The performance is pretty benign. It's even positive in some cases. Some researchers have called that proactive downsizing. You downsize when you're doing really well because maybe you see something in the future. Well, it turns out that if we look at just the downsizing size, and I think that's what you're mostly interested in, but if we look at the downsizing piece, companies have to be in worse shape before they start selling off assets. Okay? Company performance has to be markedly worse. And it's the worst of all when they sell off assets and get rid of employees. Mm-hmm. So do combination, what we call combination downsizing. And so what we found is that you don't do combination downsizing until you've been experiencing poor performance for a long time. You don't just do this in a knee-jerk reaction just because you had one bad quarter. And surprisingly, the firms that can absorb more pain before they actually take these extreme actions do the best 2 years later. Mm-hmm. So it's the old, high risk but high reward. Mm-hmm. So the takeaway for managers is that don't expect to see employee downsizing as some kind of a silver bullet that's going to help you in the short term. Mm-hmm. It's not. What we find is the longer you can wait, the more alternatives you try before you actually implement downsizing of assets or employees or both, the better off you're going to be in the long run. Uh-huh. And I was delighted to see that, Jan, because as you know, we've been in contact for a long period of time. You want to try to we want business leaders to see their people as assets to be developed, not just costs to be cut. And the more alternatives that they can take before they actually cut people, the better off. We now have 37 years worth of data showing that their stock returns are going to be much more positive than if they try to downsize employees at the first sign of trouble.
Absolutely. And, and you're making these comments based on research. You're not even getting into the morale issues and satisfaction and
we only had firm level data.
Right. I mean, how downsizing really affects.
Journalists have asked, did they let go more women, more men, more minorities? We don't know. No. All we know is the numbers that they let go because we were looking at their financial reports.
Right. But I think we know from other sources that it really affects morale and satisfaction. And I think you've said before in the past, Wayne, when we've talked that downsizing tends to happen in waves. So if they've done it, they'll probably do it again.
Oh, yeah. That's very interesting because we looked at that by industry. So you look at what's going, you have to, that's another really important point for your listeners to understand, and that is that you have to do this kind of research industry by industry. So you're comparing banks to banks, oil companies to oil companies, pharmaceuticals to pharmaceutical, because they all, within industry, they all face the same set of economic conditions, right? Even though those economic conditions could be very different in some other industry. Right? Mm-hmm. So banks could be doing great, even though oil prices are way down. So you have to look at what's going on in the industry. And there's the New Yorker magazine called it a cloning response, where you do what the leaders in your industry are doing. Follow the leader kind of thing. And we found that that's not at all a viable strategy. Mm-hmm. Don't do it. Right. Because the leaders may be doing proactive downsizing, the company's doing pretty well, and others say, oh, gee, if they're doing it, then we probably ought to do the same thing. It doesn't work.
Wow.
It doesn't work.
Well, I want to ask, I've got two questions here, and they may be similar in your response, so I'm going to read both of them. What are some practical takeaways for managers / leaders? Okay. But the other question is, during this pandemic with massive layoffs, what are the do's and don'ts that you see leaders, what are the things they're doing right? What are the things they're doing wrong? I mean,
for the first time, we've seen with the Paycheck Protection Program and the CARES Act, government has always stepped in with unemployment compensation for people who are already laid off.
mm-hmm.
What we've never seen before is government action to support employers to keep them from laying off people.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Paycheck Protection Program. Never seen that. That's the first time in public policy that I've seen that. So the government is trying to encourage employers to hang on to people as long as they can.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good thing. But what's going to happen, for example, to the airline industry when its subsidies run out on September 30th? What's going to happen to so many small businesses when the subsidies through the Paycheck Protection Program expire at the end of July?
Mm-hmm.
All of this is coming up very soon. So your questions are very timely, Jen, in terms of what advice would you give to employers? The first piece of advice is that we know that cash is the lifeblood of any organization, and organizations are doing everything they can, especially small ones, to conserve cash to make it through this pandemic. So in some cases, you may not have a choice. If you're a small business, for example, a restaurant,
Mm-hmm.
and now I can only seat 50% of the people that I would have done before that, what am I going to do? Unless I have some side business where I can keep others employed, I'm pretty well stuck.
Mm-hmm.
You may have to lay people off. But here's the takeaway. The takeaway is that just like with economic recessions, business will bounce back. When there is a vaccine, businesses will bounce back. There's no question. The key for companies is to be sure that you have the talent to be able to respond to the increased demand. So you want to keep your mission critical people at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you let them go, you may not be able to hire them again.
Mm-hmm.
There are many competitors out there that will hire them. There's always a market for top talent.
Mm-hmm.
You'll hire them away. You may not be able to get the talent that helped make you successful in the first place. So you want to do everything you can to preserve mission critical talent, or what we call pivotal talent.
Mm-hmm.
And so for business owners, they need to think carefully about the types of jobs that are going to be so essential to allowing them to maintain a successful profile. And those are the last people that you want to let go. And just letting go people is a very short-term cost-cutting move.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the hardest things, I think you and I have talked about this in the past, one of the hardest things for business owners to see is to see their people as a source of the solution rather than the source of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to the people and say, look, we need to be able to cut our costs by 25% or something like that, can you come up with ideas? People become amazingly creative when they know their own jobs are on the line.
Yes.
Amazingly creative. And
Yeah.
we've seen this in company after company that has taken this approach. Employees often come up with suggestions that far exceed the cost that they need to cut.
Right.
And it's a way of preserving their own jobs.
Right.
But it's hard for managers to see them as a source of the solution.
And what you just described is a perfect example of empowerment. Going to the people who are doing the job, and it reminds me of, and this is several years ago, but it was at a national higher education conference, and the keynote speaker was a president at a big university in Texas. I can't remember which one, but she said she went to the employees. She had an all, town hall meeting with all employees and said, I have to cut, and I don't know, $2-3 million from the budget. I want everyone to think about how to do that. And everybody went back to their own expertise, as you said.
Yeah.
And the examples, I remember to this day, the botanists, we can revive plants. We don't need to buy plants. And the janitors, the house cleaning, they had solutions. And the engineers, everybody went back to their own discipline. And I just thought, what a great example of using
another one.
Yeah, using the expertise you have within,
Yeah, here's another one, and that was Dupont. Dupont makes the paint that covers about 70% of American automobiles. And in the Great Recession, the 2007 to 9 recession, obviously people weren't buying cars. So you have a huge drop in consumer demand. What do you do if you make the paint that covers cars that are not being produced and not being sold? But instead of just laying people off, what the CEO of DuPont did was he said he got every manager together, beginning with his direct reports. And he said, I want each of you to meet with each of your direct reports and ask just for 2 to 3 cost-saving ideas that your people could come up with. Because we've got to save, I forget what the exact number was, but it was something like $50 million in order to avoid layoffs. And they wound up saving like 3 times that amount once they asked for inputs from the people who are going to be most directly affected. Right.
And it seems so logical, Wayne. Like it doesn't cost much to do this, a little bit of time, and the rewards can be so rich, and it just seems logical. So I don't get it.
It is logical, but what's even more logical, if you look at how business students are trained, they don't get trained in how to manage in a crisis.
No.
And so what they're going to do is they're going to look at the balance sheet, and they're going to look at our fixed costs and what can we do to reduce our fixed costs? What's the biggest portion of that? And if you're in a labor intensive, you mentioned the universities, 70%, 80% of their costs are people related costs. So that's a big target if you're a CFO.
Right. Wow. No, that's true.
It's hard to get out of that mode of thinking.
Yeah.
But we need more examples. We need good examples of companies that are doing this.
Right.
And they exist.
Wayne, that could be another article for you.
Right there.
You've got a lot that you can write on, that's for sure.
Sure.
And I'm very passionate about this, as you know. So any other do's and don'ts? I know in the article that was in the New York Times, and there have been several articles about this, and I'm fascinated because you and I both agree, people are to develop and their assets their assets to appreciate, not depreciate. Yeah. And what about these leaders that are using Zoom calls to lay off people?
Yeah,
can you think of anything worse?
It's heartless. It's just heartless. It's cold. It's heartless, and they're treating them like it's a plug and play mentality. Plug them in when you need them, and pull the plug when you no longer need them. And we've got 30 years of research now showing that is absolutely the worst approach to management that you could possibly implement. I was right after the New York Times article came out on Monday. One of the other people in the article, Joel Brockner at Columbia University, who studies survivors, he and I started emailing back and forth, and he's just written a Columbia Business School case on Airbnb.
Oh.
Because Airbnb had to lay off, I think, close to 2,000 people, and it's
right.
An amazing story. They actually had this something called the CARES Project, and what it was is the survivors who were going to stay used their networks to help get new jobs for those who were going to be laid off. I've never heard of something like that before.
I haven't. Excuse me. I did I read the CEO's letter. Is it?
Yeah. If you saw that, yeah.
Yes. No, it's fabulous. And what a creative way to deal with that, because survivor syndrome is real. Are you familiar with the
notion of, anytime people are faced with a decision, big decision that affects them, the first thing that goes through their heads, no matter what culture they come from, is, was that fair?
Yes.
Was that fair? Was I treated fairly? And so, these kind of heartless layoffs that you described don't contribute to people's perceptions that they're being treated fairly.
Yeah.
If anything else, they feel like they were really treated poorly.
Well, and I forget which company it was, but one CEO said, we only did Zoom audio. We didn't do Zoom video because we thought that would be too painful.
Yeah.
They didn't want to see the looks on people's faces.
That's gutless. It's just gutless and heartless. Yeah. And we know that the payoffs are so great, not only in terms of the survivors, but and this is important for your listeners or viewers to keep in mind. It's so important for your employer brand, Jan.
Yes.
Your employer brand, because when things turn around, people have long memories, and they know that people want to work at places where they're treated well.
Yes.
And the word gets out, and that's going to affect your ability to recruit and your ability to retain people over time.
Yes. I like to take notes here because it reminds me of things. Are you familiar with David Noer, N-O-E-R?
Oh, sure. Yeah, Dave and I did a workshop at the Society for IO Psychology conference a few years ago.
Okay, because he's at the Center for Creative Leadership.
Yes.
And somehow I got introduced to his book several years ago, Healing the Wounds.
Healing the Wounds, yeah.
Yeah, and so I consider you and David my two gurus on downsizing.
Well, David, he's made some amazing contributions, and I think that the lessons from his book, Healing the Wounds, they're timeless. These weren't timely in 2002 with that recession. They're just as timely now.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Exactly. Well, I want to shift gears here a little bit, and my current passion is legacy. And I think it can kind of fit into a leadership legacy. And I'm being ambiguous on purpose because I just want you to share with me whatever you're thinking. So how do you define legacy and what does it mean to you? And you can think very broadly.
Well, one of the best retorts that I remember, Johnny Carson used to have the Tonight Show.
Yeah.
The Johnny Carson Tonight Show. And he was giving a presentation at the Harvard Hasty Pudding Club. Uh-huh. And somebody in the audience asked him, Johnny, what do you want your legacy to be? And he was a comedian, of course, by trade. And his legacy he wanted on his tombstone is, I'll be right back. That was what he always said as he was going to commercials. I'll be right back.
Right.
I'll be right back. And that's what he wanted his legacy to be. I'll be right back. But a legacy is really the way you are remembered, the way people think of when they hear your name when you're no longer a player.
Uh-huh.
Either you're deceased or you're retired or no longer in the game. And we think of sports stars or entertainment stars, and we have, for example, you throw out the name Jimmy Stewart as an actor. Very positive feelings about him. Gregory Peck, people like that. So legacy is really what you leave behind.
Yeah. No, very good. Can you share a story? You just shared one, but another story that comes to mind related to you and legacy, or someone you know and legacy, maybe a leader from one of the organizations you've coached or worked with, or, it could be anybody.
Yep. I think for me personally, one of my heroes is Herb Kelleher.
Okay.
He was the late co-founder of Southwest Airlines.
Yeah.
Such a regular guy, and he, they're some of the most heavily unionized, one of the most heavily unionized organizations anywhere. I think there were 84% of their employees were unionized, and we always think of unions as, the general perception is they're an impediment, they're going to block things. That's not what happened in his relationships with workers. He would go out and hold a barbecue for the mechanics who were working the night shift. He would meet with flight attendants in a diner, after they got off duty. Very informal. They would often seal agreements with a handshake or something written on the back of a napkin. And he was so trusted by his employees to always treat them with respect, always treat them with dignity. He was often asked by a Fortune magazine writer one time, what comes first, the employees or the customers or the shareholders? And he never even hesitated. He said, for me, that's not a riddle. That's not a conundrum that I need to think about. He said, the employees always come first, because if you treat them well, they're going to treat their customers well.
Yep.
If you treat your customers well, two things happen. One of them is that the customer comes back and wants to do business with you. And the other is the customer talks to her friends or his friends and gets them to do business with you.
Right.
So you win both ways, and that's good for shareholders.
Right.
So it's employees, then customers, then shareholders.
Yeah.
Instead of, what we often hear, we used to hear all the time, shareholders first and everybody else second or third. For him, it was never a question. Right. What a great legacy to leave.
No, that's true. And that's a great example. And two things come to mind, and I don't know if they're still true, but one was, because I don't know what's going on now, airlines are all suffering, but for a while it was like Southwest Airline was the only profitable airline.
Oh yeah.
And yeah. And then the other question was, who succeeded him as CEO?
That was, I think, Colleen. I think her last name, it's Doug Parker and Colleen.
But do you know what position?
His successor was she started off as a secretary, as an executive assistant.
Yes.
I think for him.
That's what I think.
I can't think of her last name. Barrett? Yeah. Maybe Colleen Barrett.
Right, and he thought she could run the show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what a legacy to have in terms of seeing your people as assets to be developed, huh?
Yes.
Somebody who starts off as an executive assistant winds up being CEO. How many companies can you think of where that happened?
No, that's excellent. That's wonderful. Well, how do you think people might change how they view their legacy, or what legacy means to them during the pandemic? And I know this isn't probably something you've thought about, but you definitely advocate for people and employees. And so when you think about that and legacy, do you think during the pandemic there might be an awakening, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, well, it's often been said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Yeah. And, you can look at this crisis as an opportunity, really as an opportunity to leave a legacy that is going to last far beyond your own tenure, or whatever you're doing. That CEO of Airbnb that you just described.
Yes.
I mean, that's a legacy. That's for sure. And the actions that you take today are going to follow you for a long period of time. And people will remember what you did, what you failed to do during this time of crisis. Jan, a big issue is I did a webinar for the Australian HR Institute in April 1st, and it was on managing during a crisis. And there's just so little information, but that will change. That will change dramatically. But we think of a crisis as a hurricane, a natural disaster, an earthquake, something along those lines that's going to be pretty rapidly with us and then gone. Even a terrorism event. But something like this that's going to last. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and predictions are we're probably not going to have a vaccine till sometime next year, maybe a year from now. That's a long time to be managing in a crisis.
Yes.
Yeah. And so one of the things that we will see more and more is companies developing, for lack of a better term, disaster preparedness plans.
Right.
Business continuity plans. And what a legacy to leave if you can provide a blueprint or a roadmap for your successors to how to deal with a very difficult crisis like the one we are going through. So this is an opportunity for leaders everywhere.
Exactly, Wayne. And there are a couple things that I think are so interesting about this. When you think of a natural disaster, or even like 9/11, it didn't affect the entire world.
Exactly.
Like a Katrina in Louisiana, a certain part of the country. This is amazing. And the other thing, when you talk about a roadmap or a playbook, whatever you want to call it, I was talking with a woman yesterday who lives and works in Hong Kong. And she was saying that they were so ready for it because of SARS.
Yes.
And she said she said, I feel safer here than anywhere. Yeah. Because they were ready for it. Oh, that's amazing.
Well said.
Go ahead.
No, very, very well said. And, one of the real beneficial outcomes, I think, of this pandemic is we are seeing for the first time ever CEOs in various industries, whether it's hospitals or insurance companies or you name it, banks, they're all talking to each other and exchanging best practices that they have found in terms of protecting their people and their organizations from infection. Alex Gorski is the current CEO and chair of Johnson & Johnson, and he made a wonderful statement recently, and he said, business leaders, no matter what business they're in, they're going to have to become healthcare leaders.
Interesting.
Doesn't that make good sense? It's absolutely true. So we are seeing lines of communication open that have never been opened before, where, as you said, it's a worldwide thing, and people are sharing best practices. I'm on a group with the International Hospital Foundation in Geneva, where I chair the People Task Force, and we are collecting information about innovative solutions that hospitals have found in protecting their people, whether their social well-being, their psychological, their financial, or environmental.
Well, that's wonderful, because I've done a lot of research on this whole epidemic of loneliness in the workplace, and we don't have enough time to go into this, but the whole how universities and colleges are reacting to all of this. And
I'm living it.
I know. I mean, we don't have enough time to talk about it, although last Sunday on 60 Minutes, they had, I don't know if you saw it. Did you see it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The president of William and Mary and the president of University of North Carolina, and how they're reacting. Yeah. No, I thought that was informative. Well, anyway, I wish we had more time. Well, Wayne, we're kind of coming to a close here, and I always like to ask my interviewees, what else should I have asked you that either leaders need to know or you really want to share?
Yeah, well, I think we've actually hit a couple of these things, Jan.
Okay.
If there were key takeaways, it would be, in the vernacular, the result of all of our research is the more pain you can absorb before you take a drastic action like laying off people or selling off assets. The more pain you can absorb, the better off you're going to be in the long run. We saw companies, for example, that had up to 2 years of poor results, of running in the red before they actually took the drastic action of laying people off or selling off unprofitable parts of their business. And they outperformed competitors in the same industry. The more pain you can absorb before you resort to something like that, the better off you're going to be. And the second thing is that what you do now during this coronavirus pandemic is going to, in many ways, will represent your legacy going forward.
Right.
And, how you treat your people, they're going to remember that.
Yes.
How you treat your customers, they're going to remember those things. And they have long memories.
Yes. Well, that's great. Well, Wayne, I'm so honored because, as I said, I cite your work. I look for your work. I look for new work, and I like
You're
to
way too
write.
kind.
I like to write about this. You know, I beat your drum. Okay.
Well,
So,
you're way too kind, and thank you so much. I
well, thank you very much.
want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some ideas
Yeah, no, this is
today.
great. And I always say that one of my goals is to help people make the rest of life the best of life. So may the rest be the best for you, but I do want to stay in touch. So stay healthy. Stay hopeful.
We'll make that happen, Jan. Thank
Okay.
you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Have a good day and take good care of your dad.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.